gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We're now crossing the English coast and will be landing at London Airport in about 20 minutes.
Excuse me, sir. The flight you're asking about is due in 20 minutes.
Thank you very much indeed. I like being a courier, but sometimes I wish you could be anywhere else but here.
Good heavens, what for? It's a courier's paradise, small country.
Yes, that's what everyone says. It makes you feel you want to be able to show visitors everything in a short time. It's deciding what to leave out that I find difficult.
But surely that's the whole point about Britain as a holiday place. Some countries are all sunbathing, some are all ruins, some are all countries, some are all towns. But we have this amazing variety of areas, each with its own character. Now, the Lake District is like a separate country from, say, the Weald of Kent. And, of course, Scotland and Wales and Ireland are separate countries. And it's a simple matter to get from any city to the quiet of the country.
I think the country's the noisiest place. There's far more peace and quiet in London, if you know where to look for it. It may be a great capital, but you can't go far without coming to a park.
Well, the whole countryside of England is a park, really. We're a pretty crowded island, but somehow you can always get away from it. Maybe it's just because we have over 50 million people in 97,000 square miles that we preserve the rural bits so carefully.
Are you going to use that word heritage?
Why not? It means something inherited, and we have inherited the most man-made, subtle and comfortable landscape in the world. After all, it took 1,000 years to make. And every village harmonizes because it was built with local material.
Yes, and anything not locals had plenty of time to get acclimatized. Talking of getting acclimatized, take tea, for instance. Hard to imagine England without tea, but it only got here in the 18th century, and now it's one of our rituals.
The greatest ritual of all is the spring. That to a countryman at any rate. When I take people round in the summer, I always think to myself, but you should have seen it in the spring.
We town people quite like it too. All the same, I think London's the place to start. If there was a kind of Geiger counter that measured Britishness, it would tick its loudest on one of the London bridges. In fact, you could say the whole of London is a bridge, opening onto a holiday in Britain. You know what Dr. Johnson said? The man who is tired of London is tired of life. And although London goes back to the Romans, it's always being updated. They seem to be opening some smart new hotel almost every month. There are several places in London now where you can eat and drink in the greatest luxury, hundreds of feet above the ground.
Yes, and it's only when you're up there that you realize what a garden-like place it is. You seem to see as many trees as buildings. Until this century, London grew outwards, not upwards. And it's the bits from all these other centuries that are the real London for me. I like the idea of the old warrior Nelson looking down on Trafalgar Square onto a world made safe for pigeons and children and fountains. And like most people, I'm always drawn in the end to the river. and that's the oldest inhabitant of all. As Wordsworth said, the river glideth at his own sweet will.
Yes, it glideth past a lot of present-day buildings now. But there's still a tower.
Where once the king could have his own sweet will, often to cut people's heads off. Mind you, I quite admit you can do country things in London, like swimming in Hyde Park or riding in Rotten Row. But surely the real country is the proper place for doing country things, especially this lovely country like Northern Ireland. I must have a go on one of these pony treks they have up in the mountains of Mourne.
We all know what they do. The mountains of Mourne come down to the sea.
Of course, it can be rugged as well as gentle. What about that extraordinary Giant's Causeway?
What's extraordinary about it? Simply 40,000 columns of basalt of the Ternary period.
Come off it, you know very well it's one of these Irish legends lost to the sea mist, about the giant Fingal building a causeway between Ireland and Scotland.
My favourite bit of sea's a bit short on giants, but it's nearer home. It's at Brighton, London by the sea, an hour in the train. I love Brighton Pier. Maybe it's because England's so small that we built all those piers as extra bits out into the sea. And then there's Brighton Pavilion. I think it's one of the most elegantly silly buildings in the world. I'd buy it if I were rich enough. Come to think of it, you can buy something just as quaint and old, if somewhat smaller, in that antique shop district of Brighton, the Lanes. It's the only town I know with an actual antiques district.
I prefer to do my antique hunting in obscure country villages, but if it's got to be in a town, I admit you couldn't do better than in the Lanes.
I don't know. You'd have to find some pretty obscure villages to beat the London street markets for a mixture of rubbish and treasure, not to mention teeming human life.
Yes, it's almost like a permanent country fair. London has marvellous shops, but there's still room for personal commerce.
You mean haggling? I've always thought a salesman must have a bit of the showman in him, and the market is a free show. But when it comes to professional shows, there's no place like London. The curtain's rising on something new all the time.
London has 1,000 treasures. London has 1,000 pleasures.
Life and common garden.
Drury Lane.
See a play that is gay, or see Piccadilly lit up.
Let the square.
Come and dance until the dawn. See a show to
London has more theatres than any other city in the world. And naturally, Shakespeare has one of his own.
Ah, but you can't have Shakespeare without Stratford. It'd be like Hamlet without the Prince of Denmark, as they say. I like taking people down there because of the lovely Warwickshire countryside as well. And I don't just mean Anne Hathaway's cottage.
Why not end Shakespeare? After all, she was his wife.
Well, it's a small town, but it produced the greatest poet of all.
Whenever I'm there, I always try to make the trip a few miles north to see the new Cathedral of St. Michael at Coventry, joined on to the bombed ruins of the old one. Now, that would be a courier's dream. A group of cathedralologists. And if that isn't a word, it ought to be. I'd start with St. Paul's in good old London. Sir Christopher Wren said, "I'm going to dine with some men. If anyone calls, say I'm designing St. Paul's."
You'd cut out a lot of pre-cathedral stuff if you did that. What about the Roman Temple of Mithras they found just up the road? Or the Roman baths at Bath?
Yes, it's funny to think that Bath was a fashionable place 18 centuries before the 18th century.
I think to appreciate the full scale of what the Romans did, you have to see their great roads and walls out in the country. Hadrian's Wall couldn't have looked much different when it was new.
Just higher.
But even Hadrian couldn't keep the Scots out of England. Remember what Dr. Johnson said? "Sir, let me tell you, the noblest prospect a Scotsman ever sees is the high road that leads to England." Now it's the noblest prospect an English tourist sees, going the other way.
I always make a beeline for Glen Eagles myself. I feel I'm playing golf on the home ground, so to speak. I hand it to the Scots for inventing the royal and ancient game.
The royal and ancient is at St. Andrews. But never mind about golf. It's the mountains that make Scotland. That's the wonderful thing about mountains in a land. They keep all the noise out. There can be great cities near, but there are bound to be pockets of perfect peace among mountains.
Yes, peaceful. Funny how there's nothing more peaceful than a landscape full of memories of old battles. Castles like that one on Loch Alsh have seen some pretty unpeaceful times.
Oh, it isn't only peace and solitude that the mountains preserve. All kinds of local ways of life have survived the tidal wave of the 20th century. Yet somehow they don't seem to have been artificially preserved. They just belong there. Everything from those unique, shaggy Highland cattle to Scottish dancing. And it's not only their dancing that has kept its character. There's the hand-weaving of tweeds dyed with natural dyes. And the results show that there are still some things man can do that a factory can't.
Well, it's anyone's guess how many people come to Scotland for the solitude and how many for the society. I'm English to the marrow myself, but I can quite understand why Edinburgh is such a magnet. In fact, it's one of my favourite cities. It really is in a class by itself with that marvellous drama of its skyline and the castle. The whole place is like a permanent stage set, an obvious setting for an international festival.
There's still one kind of music that only Scotland itself can provide. Although, of course, they have the greatest orchestras and artists in the world there every year. A nice compact group of music lovers. That would be another courier's dream.
I'm not so sure even then. Some like opera, some like concerts.
Well, they get both at Edinburgh.
And even the ones who all like the same thing. Verdi, for example. They quarrel about who's the best singer. No, people aren't as similar as they look. Not even music lovers.
Well, I'm sure we've got enough to suit all tastes. There's town opera at Covent Garden and country opera at Glyndebourne. In fact, you get the best of both worlds at Glyndebourne. The urban art of opera with top stars, all set in a country house.
Just the place for a musical wife to take a landscape gardening husband.
Mind you, no opera chorus wears more extraordinary clothes than those you see at a place like Henley. But I suppose rowing people can have a festival as well as opera fans. And after all, Henley is to rowing what Wimbledon is to tennis.
Well, of course, people do come to Henley from America and Russia and all over.
But for my money, the greatest English open-air festival of them all is the Derby. It's still the race. Even people who only bet once a year have something on the Derby. And people who don't look at horses come on Derby Day just to look at the other people. There's nothing quite like the excitement of a big race.
I prefer cricket. It lasts longer. I know there are misguided people who think that international cricket is an elaborate way of doing nothing for 5 whole days. They ought to have heard the calypsos on the last day of the West Indies match.
But it's on the village green that you see the most interesting cricket. As a matter of fact, I prefer it on a strange village green. You're just passing through, you glimpse these white flannel figures, you stop the car, you watch them dreamily the whole afternoon, and suddenly it's evening and you're drinking with them in the pub.
Yes, you might still be there the next morning. Staying in pubs is a good way to see England, and not very expensive either. If you plotted a graph from the simple village pub right up to the grandest hotels, the greater part of it would be through places where you can get not only a drink, but very good English food as well. Remember, Dr. Johnson said his idea of heaven was driving in a post-chaise with a pretty girl. Of course, he couldn't have anticipated English post-chaises that can do 100 miles an hour.
I know the new motorways weren't built just so that people could race up them in sports cars. Arteries of commerce, speed the trucks and all that. All the same, they do bring the countryside within much easier reach. And of course it works both ways. The more people use the motorways, the more room there is when you get on the little side roads.
You know, to me, the supreme glory of our countryside is the great historic house. My favourite's the biggest of them all, Blenheim Palace, where Churchill was born. A great house for a great man. I've always remembered that epitaph on Vanbrugh, the architect of Blenheim. Lie heavy on him earth, for he laid many heavy loads on thee.
It's fine to see all these great houses and their furnishings, But I'm more interested in the period before they really bothered much about furnishings at all. The period of the castles, like Beaumaris or Carnarvon. I'd start my tour in Wales, or maybe just at the edge of Wales, at Tintern.
Tintern's an abbey, not a castle.
Yes, I know it is, but it's like a castle in one respect. The barons and the monks both knew a good location when they saw one, although the castle sought domination and the abbey sought peace, and you can still sense it in the ruins. Of course, you could see something older than any abbey or castle on the River Wye nearby. They still use coracles made with skins, as in the days of the ancient Britons.
Let's admit it. The modern Britons have a fondness for anything over 100 years old. We're kind to old trains the way we're kind to old horses. Even though our main lines have all been dieselized or electrified, we still preserve things like the old rack and pinion railway that goes up Snowdon. Now that's the way to go up a Welsh mountain, or any other mountain for me.
No, I think railways have no business on mountains. We're not all decadent city types, you know. Just remember there's another way up Snowdon that separates the men from the boys. The men who climbed Everest trained on it.
However you get up there, there's certainly some kind of excitement about height and air, and being where only birds belong. You know, I've often wondered if that isn't part of the exhilaration of a modern holiday, the flying. You start the whole thing in the air. I can never quite take for granted this experience, absolutely unknown to man before this century, of seeing some famous old city all at once, laid out like a great three-dimensional map. What a wonderful first impression it gives of a place like London.
Ah, but it's only when you come down to earth that you see what variety our visitors can enjoy.
They can lead the active life.
Or the contemplative life. They can see capers in Scotland.
And capers in Wales.
Games where you swear.
And games where you wouldn't dare.
Traditions that go on without stopping.
Or just shopping. The pleasure by day.
Or the pleasures by night, among many faces.
Or the pleasure of lonely places.
Announcing the arrival of flight BA510 from New York.
That'll be our party now. Well, we're agreed on one thing. There are more things to see and enjoy in Britain than we could possibly show the visitors in a score of holidays. There's as many things for them to see and do here as there are kinds of people.